360. When you're in the mirror, do you like what you see? When you're in the mirror, you're just looking at me. I'm everywhere, I'm so Julia. When you're in the party, bumping that beat. 666 with a princess streak. I'm everywhere, I'm so Julia.
I'll be bumping that. No, I'll never go home, don't sleep, don't eat, just do it on repeat. Keep. When I'm in the club, yeah, I'm 365 party girl. Should we do a little key? Should we have a little line? Wanna go real wild when I'm meet me in the bathroom with you. 365 party girl. French manicure, whipper with a residue. I look hot when I'm. No, I really don't stop when I'm gonna jump when it drops when I'm down 999. It's a good time. Who the fuck are you? I'm a brat when I'm bumping that. No, I wanna hear my track. Are you bumping that? Till the windows crack, I'll be bumping that. No, I'll never go home, don't sleep, don't eat, just do it on repeat. Keep. When I'm in the club, yeah, I'm 365 party girl. Should we do a little key? Should we have a little line? Wanna go real wild when I'm meet me in the bathroom with you. 365 party girl. French manicure, wipe away the residue. Keep. 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 so confusing sometimes to be a girl, 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 girl. It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl, 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 girl.
Greetings. The program will begin in 5 minutes. We will be recording the entire event for documentation purposes, so kindly observe proper Zoom etiquette throughout. Again, the program will begin in 5 minutes. We will be recording the entire event for documentation purposes, so kindly observe proper Zoom etiquette throughout. Thank you.
How do you feel being a girl? How do you feel being a girl? Girl, and I don't know, I'm just a girl, 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 girl. Yeah, I don't know if you like me. Sometimes I think you might hate me. Sometimes I think I might hate you. Maybe you just wanna be me. You always say let's go out, so we go eat at a restaurant.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to PIDC 2024's Issues Forum. We're glad you'll be here with us today for this engaging talk. I'm Aya, and I will be your moderator for this event. The voice of the youth becomes more critical than ever. The theme, Transform Tradition, delves into how Filipino youth, particularly debaters, can navigate the landscape of political disillusionment, social upheaval, and digital transformation. This year's Issues Forum at the Philippine Intercollegiate Debating Championship, or PIDC, invites debaters to reflect on their role in these turbulent times. Through the Issues Forum, we aim to explore how debaters, with their skills in debate and public speaking, can challenge the status quo, advocate for vulnerable groups, and foster responsible, decisive, and directional transformation. As tradition increasingly becomes a tool for oppression rather than progress, and truth becomes ever more elusive, it is imperative that the youth reimagine their role not just as participants in debate, but as catalysts for change in the digital world. Before we proceed any further, let us all give a warm welcome to our very own Nico Mempin, the Deputy Director, Tournament Director for PIDC 2024, to deliver the opening remarks.
Hi everyone. Good morning. Many things have changed since the inception of PIDC. Many things have changed as well since the first online installment of PIDC in 2021. We've learned to adapt, to change, and to grow, and we've come a long way as a circuit. We've aimed high, we've reached the world, but a few questions remain constant. How do we take our skills as debaters, our resolve, and our capability to speak on issues outside of competitive debating, outside of rounds where we are scored, outside of the want to win? Where does our empathy fall into our speeches? And how do we transcend the confines of this sport to amount to something greater and more meaningful? At the face of cultural shifts, technological advancements, political turbulence, and the blurring lines between truth and fiction, we have a greater responsibility as debaters and citizens to figure these things out. On behalf of this year's organizing committee, I welcome everyone to this year's Issues Forum with the theme Transforming Truth, Debating in an Era of Political Disillusionment. I'm also pleased to extend my warm welcome as well to our speakers, Professor Jonathan Corvus Ong and Mix Gabriel Pacaño, who both graciously agreed to take some time off their day for today's event. Once again, on behalf of the organizing committee, as well as extending my warm welcome from the rest of the core adjudication panel, hello everyone and good morning.
Thanks so much for the opening remarks, Nico. Now, for this year's Issues Forum, we invited two distinguished individuals in their respective fields of expertise. Our first speaker is a professor of global digital media and director of the Global Technology for Social Justice Lab in the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's a co-author of the pioneering ethnographic study of disinformation for hire workers in the Philippines, published as Architects of Network Disinformation and Trolls for Sale. His podcast, Catch Me If You Can, from the work arrangements and moral justifications of digital precarious workers, as well as top level executives in so called troll farms in the Philippines. He is one of the founders of the Sigla Action Research Center for Resilient Public Spheres, an NGO bridging researchers and civil society leaders. Let us all welcome Jonathan Corpus Ong.
Thank you so much, Aya. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here. It's 10 p.m. where I'm at, and so forgive me for the background, but I'm so excited to meet and have a conversation with some of the smartest students in the Philippines. I'm really looking forward to the question time, and I'm here to first just share my slides, and I hope you can all hear me fine. All right. And is this visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, thank you, Aya. All right, so first, a disclaimer, I'm not a debater, but some of my very best friends our debaters. So that includes my frequent collaborator and co-author, Professor Nicole Curato, who's based in Australia. I had asked my other friend, Professor Leloy Claudio, about PIDC, and he was the one actually who said that, this is like a really great opportunity to connect with, the smartest kids in the country. And so thank him for encouraging me to be here. I had also dated a DebSoc debater at one point, and I will not be naming any names, but I feel like I'm an insider outsider in the debate space, and I'm really happy to have received, such a well thought out set of questions from the organizers about the mission and vision for debate, especially in today's very fractious and polarized political climate. And so, my title for my presentation is Debate in the Disinformation Age, and I'll be centrally engaged with the question of what are the values that debaters should hold and should be thinking about in an information environment where disinformation is not only widespread, but in some ways highly profitable, especially among certain sets of influencers and digital operators. And I think we can work through this, giant question altogether. I won't be providing a simple and direct answer. Again, I'm not a debater. I think it's for you guys to work through on your own. But I'm here to share with you my own original academic research that can provide backgrounds on what exactly are we facing in today's information environment. And I'll also be sharing with you some resources, including community interventions that I have collaborated with local civil society workers in the Philippines. So feel free to connect with me on Twitter or X at Jonathan_C_Ong. Happy to take the conversation there. Most of the stuff I'll be sharing will be linked on my link tree, including links to open access research. I'm a big believer in making knowledge accessible and free, and I think that's really important, especially working as a Filipino based in the US, but my work is still very much centrally engaged with the Philippines and the global South. I'm also always looking for, junior researchers, assistants, interns, and so I have like a container to help train and connect and mentor you around issues related to disinformation and the digital environment. So here are central questions, burning questions for today that I want to be working through with you. And Aya, please nudge me if I'm like 5 minutes to my time. So the first question is, what counts as responsible political participation in digitally mediated spaces? So I'm a communication scholar, and so I'm not wholly pessimistic about digital media and ways of engaging with each other online. I think a lot of contemporary life is lived with and through our media, through digital platforms. And so I don't agree with interpretations that digital media is all pessimistic, all dystopic, all harmful, to um, even to our mental health, for example. I think there are good and also there are bad ways of consuming and producing media content and relating with each other online, but we don't always agree on the ethics, right? And that's why my second question is, what are the digital communication ethics most relevant to this polarized political moment? What are the values that should guide our practices as consumers and producers of social media content? For example, should we judge experts for their authenticity and relatability, just as we hold those standards when we judge influencers we follow on Instagram? Is that fair to be using the same sets of standards? So my final question is about debate, and I love how you phrased the question about debate and how could it be used as a space, right? How can it be a space to help to hold more productive conversations? Is one of the prompt questions that you shared with us, and I think that's a great way of thinking about debate. It's a communication space. It's a communication style. It's one kind of space. It's not the only one. And so it's important to think about its opportunities, but also its limitations, right? Especially if we think of like higher level objectives of social justice movements, for example, or community healing. Like, is debate the correct or appropriate relevant space to facilitate some of these kinds of movements or these difficult conversations to help bridge people across political divides, for example? Is debate the right kind of space and communication style for that? So I'm curious to know how you might want to think of curating the space of debate and your championship, right? Like for this moment and also for the future. So more playfully, and here I'm asking for a friend. Here are, some very practical questions that I think always come up in discussions, especially when I meet with college students in the Philippines, in person or virtually like this. And also questions that I'm working through, right? So I'm asking for a friend. Should I unfriend my Tita Trump supporter? What are the ethics of engaging with people with radically different political beliefs than you? Should I be canceled for talking with Duterte trolls? So is it strategic, just like in my own research, to open a conversation, to probe the psychology of people we consider trolls who spread toxicity online and have learned how to monetize outrage and divisiveness? What are the dangers around that, right? Like, should I be canceled for trying to do this? And here, a question that's particularly personal. Should I avoid dating people who think believers of astrology are delusional? And so I think this is a very practical question. It's a playful question, but thinking through again divides and how it should affect us in our personal life. Like, is it fair to draw those boundaries just as we do that in the public sphere? And so the distinction between the public and the private, right? And I think it's interesting how a lot of these issues hit closer and closer to home. Okay, so to unpack all these questions, I'll first be taking a step back and take us through some key features of what I consider our very fragmented information ecosystem today. So this plays into like the broader backdrop of the status of debate and communication styles and what's a right way of engaging with others online, right? So first of all, let me give a caveat that I'm against technological determinism. So this is an explanatory framework that assumes that new technologies by themselves are all powerful, that they kind of exist in a way outside of society and they transform society through their all powerful logics. So there's a common idea that new technology could rewire brains or have capacities to brainwash their users, right? I actually am against that idea. I think we need to get a greater nuance. And let me get you at some of those tensions, right? So there's ways of thinking about our information ecosystem as having opportunities, but also risks. So think of social media platforms and the algorithms that curate our personal experiences. So on one hand, we can think of how algorithms and our algorithmically driven news feeds can on one hand function to oppress. They can function to confirm racial stereotypes and gendered stereotypes, such as in the work of Safiya Noble, Algorithms of Oppression. So search in her work, search engine algorithms perpetuate and reinforce dangerous narratives about Black communities and dehumanize them further. On the other hand, algorithms can also enact ways in which people can achieve and aspire and find new meaning, find new hope from where they are. So, in the work of Indian scholar Payal Arora, she talks about algorithms of aspiration. In her research about the youth in the global south, she captures that the youth in the global south are quick to embrace new technologies, new trends on TikTok and social media because they enable them to transcend real caste divisions, gendered hierarchies in their local villages. So social media actually enables them play, aspiration, new ideas. So it empowers them to seek other like-minded people outside of their own locale with very repressive value systems. So another theme is around filter bubbles. On one hand, they might indeed confirm our biases. They might be self-serving, so they might actually keep us in our bubble, keep us in our echo chamber, allow us to ignore counter evidence on issues that we don't want to face. But on the other hand, filter bubbles can be good for affirming small group identities, especially for minoritized and marginalized groups. Queer people, trans people, migrant queer people, for example, can find greater affinity and belonging online and maybe even lead towards more radical movements. Think of racial justice protests or feminist movements enabled by social media. So it can do good, it can also do bad, right? So that's what I'm trying to say here. On artificial intelligence, we're just right at the infancy of AI and generative AI, and we don't really have regulatory and monitoring systems to, effectively judge AI as a whole. But we can do that at a smaller scale. So for me, I'm a professor, I'm a teacher. In the classroom, I have my own sets of rules about good and bad AI use. I lean more towards transparency rather than banning AI altogether. So I encourage my students to be transparent whether they had consulted ChatGPT or not. So on one hand, this is a very local set of rules around AI. We can have a different set of rules for AI in other kinds of contexts. But certainly, like there's a way, you mentioned disillusionment, an era of political disillusionment. There's really, for journalists, for politicians, for academics, for, traditional experts, and even for political parties, there's this idea that playing politics nowadays is radically different from before. So here I'm just sharing a Time Magazine article, and you can have a look at my link tree to read this article where I talk about how the election of Marcos and his campaign choices were just radically different. That people were not prepared to handle, for example, his decision not to participate, not to show up in a debate, which is a brand new tactic that he employed, that he just did not show up at all. I mean, even Duterte, whom we had attributed as being very savvy in terms of social media, um, looking back, it was actually his debate appearance. Remember, like his remark about like he would jet ski to the disputed territories in the South China Sea. That's in a way like a media event moment, like in live television. But Marcos, because of our fragmented information ecosystem, he could ignore the political center that the media holds and controls, that mainstream media holds, for his own kind of information ecosystem that he had cultivated slowly over the years through his YouTube channels and the new kinds of influencers that are highly partisan towards him. And if you look at that article, I also critique how liberal weapons of historical accuracy and fact checking are simply no match for creative folklore of Marcos, turbocharged by fan culture on social media and influencer relatability. And I think those are new features of campaigning that we need to be thinking about, and that we shouldn't always be thinking about the political game as an argument or a conversation based on facts. So And here is an example of a collaboration that I did with Media Commoner. So they are active on Instagram. So they're kind of like a media watchdog. Follow them at Media Commoner on Instagram. And here's like an Instagram slideshow that went viral after the elections. And so this is something I co-authored with them as a way to, try to shape the conversation in the public sphere. And my argument here is sometimes we always think about persuasion as about like what's the better argument, how to get that through, how to convince the other side. But this analysis talks about ritual performance and the performance of victimhood. And ultimately, right, this is a false victimhood performance, right, of the Marcoses to, try to win over Pinoy sympathy for the underdog, that they, are a family that have been silenced by the liberal elites, that there's a conspiracy among academics, among historians, among journalists to silence their perspective, right? And so for me, it's a victimhood performance that manufactures a kind of relatability that if a family like us can be victimized by the liberal elites, composed of academics, historians, experts, journalists, and liberal elite establishment politicians. So this is their way to make themselves relatable with the massa or with the disenfranchised, with the anxious sectors of society. So again, an argument that we need to think about, not just debate, and sometimes the genre of debate is so much about the better argument, but let's think about it as well about ritual performance. And and that's why myth making and the use of cinema and film, right, like in the rehabilitation of their brand was so essential to their victory, I think. Hello, should I continue? I'm just hearing some noise. Yes.
Yes, you may proceed.
Okay, great. Next slide is about influencers and how, again, another feature, how to think about our information environment today, about how knowledge influencers, it's a term that we develop in this report, Parallel Public Spheres, where we catalog the new kinds of personalities that try to shape and influence political discourse in the last election cycle. And we talked about the personality that we call knowledge influencers. And who are they? These are the credentialed pundits and self-styled experts who peddle hyper-partisan analysis with very dubious and politicized data interpretation. And we also talk about their special ability that whether it's doom and gloom or just asking questions, their expert commentary affirms political fans' biases instead of inviting critical reflection. And here there's a caricature of a knowledge influencer that might look familiar to you, but you can see them on YouTube, you can see them also on broadcast media, on Twitter threads, or on Facebook posts. But I argue that these kinds of knowledge influencers are radically different from the experts, the pundits, the institutions of the past, where in the past you would expect experts or institutions to kind of like show a little balance, to kind of like temper people's sense of outrage, and to kind of like unpack the issue along multiple angles and like really look at all different sides of an issue. These knowledge influencers are there to, in a way, affirm and just cater to one political group or camp. And I think that's wholly different from the kinds of academic, training that older pundits, platform by broadcast media would practice and would deem as the right way of engaging their audiences. And I think this is again very different, and we need to find ways to judge this kind of work. I also argue in this study, Parallel Public Spheres, that knowledge influencers exist across the political across political camps. It's not just the Marcoses or the Dutertes, but liberal camps would have their own knowledge influencers who would peddle hyper-partisan analysis, who would argue against academic rigor or the rigor of polls, for example. And I think we need to call them out, even though they might be our allies, so-called allies. And therefore, with these kinds of new features, we are now left with questions of what's a good way of engaging with them online? What's a responsible way of participating online? So, a practical question that I've in yeah that always comes up is, should we fight fire with fire, or do we condemn ourselves by using the tools of the enemy? So here's a one feature that we discuss again in the same report, Parallel Public Spheres, is the move towards cancel culture, canceling, about how digital mobs try to seek accountability to, and they turn to name and shame online rituals that often lead to othering rather than understanding. And sometimes it's a winner takes all mindset, sometimes it's a gamification of politics by hunting down enemies. Sometimes it's a purity politics of you need to show a complete allegiance to one side. And there's no one full answer. And even among myself and my co-authors, including Professor Corato, we disagree among ourselves that maybe in some contexts, cancel culture is good, but in other contexts where cancel culture in a way piles on people from a lower power position, then that's not a good look. Like if we are out there to kind of bully somebody lower than us, then I think that's not a good way of using tools of cancel culture, for example. Um, and then another intervention that I myself think about and have tried to do in my work is to talk with trolls. I mean, I authored a study that interviews people behind digital operations, people who are at the low level of the food chain, but also those at the top of the food chain who are actually the ones organizing their digital armies. In our podcast, Catch Me If you can hear their own voice. And we wanted to make sure people hear them in their own voice so that the idea of troll doesn't seem too distant. They're not too other. Because we sometimes have that stereotype that they're so far removed from us. But the argument of Catch Me If You Can in my own research is that they can actually be your classmate. They can be my former student. They look just like you, right? And but I myself and our podcast has been criticized. My research has been criticized. I've been canceled by other journalists for so-called platforming trolls. And I think that's one criticism that I think about in my own work, and that's a balancing act of trying to humanize and try to understand, these people that we disagree with, but through that process of humanization, understand the depths and the structural and systemic nature of the problem. That's important to think about. That is actually more normalized than you think. They're not these radical evil creatures, in Davao or in Ilocos, but they actually are working in Makati, right? So that's the argument. But also the fact that it's important to know and hold accountable the people at the top, because there's a way that we talk about trolls in a very demeaning way, in a very anti-massa way, that we think of trolls as, oh, these are the massa, these are the people who are paid peanuts. But actually, the trolls at the top, we don't think about and talk about, but they're the ones who need to be called out. And that's something that, a real ethnographic research. And yeah, and please check out our podcast and please let me know what you think, whether we succeed in that. So what are alternative spaces for healing and justice? So I'm down to my last 5 minutes. Um, so I'm thinking about the question of debate as a space and what it can achieve, right? And I'm trying to pose the argument that if we think of debate as a space to exchange arguments through reason, and that we evaluate it based on eloquence, based on um, reverting to the right evidence. There's opportunities for that, but we need to also think about its limits. And here are some more open-ended kinds of spaces that try to achieve community healing in some cases, or social justice movements. Um, and I wonder what you think about, these kinds of spaces and where they sit alongside the genre of the debate space. So my colleagues, for example, are talking about Asian American families. I mean, think of any, for example, titos and titos you might have who live abroad, right? And here, the idea is that Asian Americans have very different political beliefs based on their generation, that the older generation tend to be more conservative, the younger people are more progressive. And so some colleagues of mine are trying to have conversation guides, like to bridge those conversations between younger and older, but with the idea that there should be mutual respect, that the elder shouldn't just talk down on the kid, just as the kid shouldn't think of themselves as always the more enlightened generation compared to their conservative tito, for example. So I think that's interesting to think about, and I wonder how you evaluate that. My colleague Nicole Corato talks about deliberative fora with ordinary citizens. So I think her research method is, let's poll people at the community level, at the grassroots, have them discuss human rights, have them discuss disinformation. What are their lay understandings of these important, complex topics? And it's a way in which we can have a temperature check of what people are thinking at the current moment, right? And hopefully that lay thinking and understanding can shape policy down the road. I think that's her method, and other people will have their own um, evaluations of that. In our own collaborations with civil society groups, we've advocated for worker wellness initiatives, particularly among human rights workers who feel disillusioned over the past years, that their work has been smeared and tarnished, that nobody believes in human rights anymore, right? And so these worker wellness initiatives are, kwentuhan among colleagues. They're not meant to have a concrete objective, but just to develop collegiality and coping among people, workers who are just really exhausted and worn out and burnt out, right? So that's one space for healing, right? And then think of like social justice movements, and I obviously based here in the United States, thinking about the student protest, protesting against the ongoing genocide happening right now in Gaza, how TikTok has enabled an archive of that protest, but also through sharing videos from the war zone, witnessing the costs of war and genocide, and how that has continued to mobilize students. So my colleagues back home in the Philippines have started Sigla Action Research, and we're looking to work with students like you. We think of it as a research center on one hand, but also as a way to create a third space among academics, educators, community organizers, and human rights advocates. And here I will end with this slide just in time. Yeah, for our discussion, and I look forward to all your reflection about who do you think might also feel excluded in the context of debate? Like, what kinds of outreach mechanisms and ways of opening up access to the debate as a space, as you mentioned, what are opportunities of expanding um, the debate space to other communities and other students? How can debaters make use of their own space for community healing or mobilize for social justice? Do you think that it's more relevant towards projects for healing or more for like more activist kinds of movements? And finally, what are skills and values that debaters hold that can, help clarify responsible political participation in today's polarized political environment? So these are all exciting questions, and I can't wait to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan. It was really interesting to hear your talk about the different nuances involved in the current scene of discourse. Since, as debaters, it is essential to remain vigilant when engaging with others, especially with the various challenges that arise in political and digital spaces to ensure more productive conversations on pertinent issues. Now, moving on to our next speaker. Our second speaker is a recent graduate of the University of the Philippines, Diliman, with a bachelor's degree in social work. As an intern with Children International, he worked with disadvantaged children in Metro Manila during his field instruction program. This experience fostered his passion for child safeguarding and service delivery. He also completed his field instruction in Lipa City, where he spent the semester working with the urban poor community. There, he gained a deeper understanding of their collective struggle for housing rights and equitable access to basic services. As a student leader, he served in various leadership positions within the university as a as the chairperson of the UP CSWCD FST Council and the college student representative to the University Student Council. Yes. He deeply values the importance of genuine student representation and the role that the youth sector plays in societal transformation. Let us now welcome Gabriel Pagani.
All right, hello. So I'll just share my screen. All right, can people confirm that my screen is visible? Can I get
Your
a
screen
like?
is visible.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to be able to speak today. Last year, I was invited to speak as part of the deliberation panel um, in PIDC 2022. And ngayon, ako naman yung keynote speaker. So I'm very excited to be able to deliver my topic. I'm also excited to see familiar faces, some people I've judged before, debated against, or my org mates. So I'm happy. I'm also happy to see new debaters joining here today to listen. So the topic for today, or the title, is Real or Fake, or Fake, Uncovering the Mysteries of Compassion Fatigue and its Impact in Youth Action. So Mr. Jonathan Ong focused on the communication aspect of political disillusionment and its implication on youth activism. I will be focusing on the cognitive behavioral aspect, primarily because of my social work background and given that these concepts are the most proximate to me. So, okay. So gusto ko lang din na maging informal yung discussion natin given na kwentuhan lang din tong pagbabahagian natin na to ngayon. Okay. So ngayon, gusto ko lang din ilatag or establish yung context ng ating discussion. So gusto kong umikot tayo or mag-revolve tayo around sa fact na tayo ay nasa age of information na. And nakikita natin na very pervasive yung media and very pervasive yung information saturation. Kadalasan, marami tayong nababalitaan ng mga masasamang mga balita, kagaya for example, COVID-19, yung pagkapanalo ng Unity Team, yung pagka-overturn ng Roe v. Wade sa US, yung aggression ng China sa West Philippine Sea, yung geopolitical war crimes ng Russia at Iran and or natural disasters na very pervasive, or yung mga balitang ito ay nakakabahala emotionally at naapektuhan din yung normal funk natin. So, ano nga ba? Ito sa topic natin ngayon, usapan natin yung ABCDs of compassion fatigue. Sinadya ko yan para masadali siyang sundan and para masadali siyang tumatak. So, okay. So, ano nga ba yung compassion fatigue? Sorry. So, A is for acknowledging its existence. So, what is compassion fatigue? So, these are the feelings of disillusionment, apathy, and feeling emotionally stretched. So it is a state of exhaustion and dysfunction, biologically, physiologically, and emotionally, as a result of prolonged exposure to compassion stress, according to Fidgley in 1995, as cited in Hofmeyr 2020. So for context, ang compassion fatigue normally na-experience ito ng helping professions, kagaya ng mga psychiatrists, counselors, social workers, teachers, or nurses, kasi sila yung nagdi-deal sa very traumatic incidents or sila yung nagdi-deal sa emotionally charged situations kung saan kailangan nila mag-provide ng emotional support or ng emotional way of reacting to these situations. Pero, in the age of information, kaya nag-arise uli yung concept na ito, mas naging saturated na or mas naging pervasive na yung gantong mga balita or mas naging pervasive na yung access natin sa information. So hindi na lang daw helping professions yung apektado ng compassion fatigue. Pwede na rin na students na may empathy, pwede na rin activists, pwede na rin mga normal TV viewers or normal readers or average reasonable readers ng newspapers. So mahalaga na suriin natin kung ano nga ba yung implikasyon ng compassion fatigue sa atin, no? Okay, sige. So bakit nga ba ang compassion fatigue sa generation natin ngayon? So unang-una, kagaya ng ko kanina, the internet's information saturation has enabled real-time access to a vast array of information. Kung ano yung mga nababalitaan natin, hindi rin natin kayang i-filter or i-block out yung mga gantong bagay. Kasi kung ano yung mga dimensions na immerse tayo, kagaya for example ng social media, ng TV headlines, or even in day-to-day normal conversations, no, nababalitaan natin yung mga ganito mga klase ng balita. And mahalaga ring suriin na hindi tayo lahat emotionally trained para i-process to or emotionally capable para i-process to on our own. So kadalasan, hindi natin napapansin na nakakaranas na rin tayo ng emotional fatigue or ng compassion fatigue. Second, we are human beings capable of empathizing. So again, as human beings, meron tayong basic human decency to care, especially as debaters na I'm assuming no na lahat tayo ay well, if not ignorant, more on the knowledgeable side. So meron tayong alam at syempre dapat meron din tayong pake. So yung basic assumption na meron tayong pake also means na we have to empathize the issues na tinatakal natin or dinidiscuss natin sa debating sphere. So understanding patriarchy also comes at the cost of empathizing with women's suffering or realizing that the queer community right now is being persecuted or being attacked also comes at the cost of experiencing or empathizing with their pain, even if it's not on the same level, no, it still gradually increases given the information saturation na sinabi natin. At yung pangatlo, our brains, and this is more of a biological explanation, are wired to experience discomfort and distress primarily because our brain short circuits to survival mode, especially if we hear negative situations. So kapag nakarinig daw tayo ng mga negative situations, yung brains natin nag-go siya with fight or flight mode, which induces stress hormones or which makes it even harder for us to function normally. So ito yung mga tatlong bagay na nagda-direct kung bakit mas naging pervasive or bakit mas nagiging trend yung compassion fatigue even for young people like us. So, ayan. So, yung letter B sa ABCDs ay breaking down our responses. So, how do people normally respond to compassion fatigue? Sabi, as a result of emotional burnout, we pass on the responsibility to people who we think are directly responsible for these events. So, magandang example din siguro yung recent reaction ng liberals or ng progressive people towards the unity winning. So, instead of blaming the system or instead of blaming Sara Duterte or BBM, well, I'm not generalizing naman because I know that we're more on the knowledgeable side or we're on the more nuanced side of it. Most of, or if not all, in the vast majority of cases, a lot of people blame the voters instead of the people who ran and perpetuated fake news or disinformation, primarily because we don't want to feel responsible on the bad things that are happening. So most of the time, dahil nga ayaw natin na mag-partake or mag-participate sa responsibility or ayaw din natin i-shoulder yung ganung negative feeling, we're pointing our hands towards the people who voted for these terrible politicians. Or kasi ayaw nating bitbitin yung ganung responsibilidad or ayaw nating tignan yung posibilidad na nanalo sila. So yung sisi na lang natin ay towards the voters, which creates hostility. Or nung COVID-19, instead of pointing out to the incompetent leaders, we pointed out first to the Chinese nationals, given the recent emergence or the emergence before of xenophobia. So nakikita na dahil ayaw nating buhatin yung responsibilidad dahil it's very emotionally heavy, ang unang pwedeng possible response ay victim blaming. So mahalaga na aware tayo sa mga gantong biases or aware tayo sa mga gantong prejudice, especially not only as debaters, but as basic human beings. So, inaalisan natin yung sarili natin ng responsibility and pinapasa natin ito sa most direct people who we think are directly responsible. Pangalawa, humor as a way of coping. And I'm personally also guilty of this as someone who jokes a lot. So, some people, when they experience negative emotions or negative situations, or when they hear about bad news, they package this as something that people can meme about, we can joke about to lighten up the mood. This can be positive or negative. Obviously, for the positive aspect of this, hindi naman natin lahat kayang process lahat directly or hindi naman din maganda na i-rationalize agad natin or i-intellectualize agad natin yung discussion kasi that's not a natural default of our brains. So pwede rin siguro na we can joke about it pero on moderation. Kasi magandang example kung bakit pwede siya maging negative, yung recent emergence ng Shiminute memes. So alam ko naman na lahat tayo familiar dito kasi yung kay VP Sara to, no? Kasi ano nangyari, na-divert yung attention sa OVP's negligence towards their negligence sa budget and mas naging conflict na siya between Tagalog and Bisaya speakers, which Sara Duterte could potentially exploit to highlight perceived Tagalog elitism and fuel regionalism for her advantage. So magandang case study to on how Tagalog elitism could be a jumping entry point for I don't know, regionalism and how this could create further antagonism that again politicians can use to win future elections. Yeah, like yung narratives na it's the Tagalogs being elitists, they're joking about our accents, they're making fun of the way we speak, and therefore that's not good. So instead of focusing and being direct towards the negligence of VP Sara, a lot of people memed about it, and I'm guilty of laughing about it. Pero siguro on a closer look at it, it's something that we have to be careful about. And yung pangatlo, and I think we can all relate to this, we create a higher threshold for tolerating suffering. So as debaters, we study patterns of events to understand their historical context. So we usually overload ourselves with bad news and hostile information at a constant pace that could lead to desensitization. So for example, 5 structural reasons why this harms the stakeholder or why this is bad for us. So we usually matter load, and usually if it's more graphic or if it's too extreme, we usually read it and it usually gets attached to our brains kasi we can use it in for future references during debate rounds. So sabi, nagkakaroon daw ng higher threshold for tolerating suffering, but that's not always good kasi too much can also lead to desensitization, especially if you don't process it normally. So sometimes, normal na lang sa atin yung pagkarinig ng news about people dying. And sometimes, we use this in debates without further thinking about the real life or real-time impacts of how this affects people. And as debaters, I think it's really, really important to think about the way we process and break down information. So I think aside from using it for information's sake for debates, I think it's also very important to understand why these things are happening, to also understand what our role is as university students, as casual debaters or competitive debaters. So I think it's really, really important to talk about these things also as well. All right. So letter C is how do we combat compassion fatigue? So ecological systems framework is a framework that is usually used in social work to understand person situation or problem person situation. So bear with me. I will be using a lot of social work jargons for context because I'm also reviewing for the board exam next week. So I have to be proficient. So I'll be using a lot of this to also refresh myself. So it's a double-edged sword. So ecological systems framework, it's really important to understand the connections or how each and everything is related to each other. So earlier we have said that, or we established that everything can be compounded. So the threshold for information is a lot higher. So maraming, given the vast array of information, medyo mahirap i-process siya individually. So I think what ecological systems framework helps us with is that it guides us to see how everything is related, or it guides us to see how everything is connected. So the way this affects our brains is that instead of seeing each other individually or in isolation of each other, we kind of connect everything and explain what caused it, or point out specific stakeholders that eventually caused it. So a good example of this is, for example, the different issues in the Philippines. So most of the time, we see these things individually. So it's hard to hold each and everything accountable, especially if we hold them individually. So it's better if we try to collate them. Think of one specific system that enabled it, like for example, terrible governments or imperialism or foreign intervention. And then it's easier for us to process information in that specific way, no? Kasi hindi mo na siya kailangan isa-isahin. It's a singular information packet, and it's easier for you to process it. It's easier for you to see how things are related. And it's also easier to act, or it's easier to mobilize yourself, given that it's not as hard, primarily because our target can exist, or our targets are fewer than we've imagined. So ecological systems framework. Second, partialization and prioritization. So this is also a social work tool that we use with our clients. So usually we work with people with problems. So if we're dealing with problems, most of the time, yung clients natin or yung clients namin as social workers, hindi nila kayang i-process yung problem kasi it's too big. So the technique or the strategy to be able to cope with it is that we use partialization techniques, or we try to break bigger issues into smaller issues, which I think is also similar with debating. So instead of debating a grander theme of a concept, we try to break this down into layers. So I think that's also a good way of understanding, or it's also a good way of understanding how we can go about certain problems or go about these problems. The second tool is prioritization. Someone is unmuted. Oh wait. Hello. All right. So I guess someone's just unmuted. All right. The second tool is prioritization. So obviously, as limited human beings, we don't have all the resources to be able to solve problems. So it's on things. What are the things that we can prioritize? What are the things that we can do to resolve these kinds of problems? I think it's better if we don't try to solve all these things in just one shot or in just one act. We try to prioritize things. And again, this is very similar with debating, because we have to prioritize better arguments to fit it in within the 7-minute speech that we have. So what I realized is that a lot of the things that we do in social work or we do in normal life is also a bit similar in debating. So that's a bit helpful, not only for me, but for everyone to understand how we can deal with compassion fatigue. And this is also a tool. So scope of control. So this is a tool that I use when I work with children. So most of the time, children that are victims of SA or sexual abuse tend to blame themselves. So tend to blame themselves for things out of their control. So what I did is that I made them draw a quadrant. So this is what the quadrant looks like. So this quadrant explains the things that we can do, the things we can change, the things that we cannot do, and the things that we could not change. So usually I make them write the things, or I make them write the things that they are part of their control. Like ano yung mga kaya nilang gawin as children, or ano yung mga kaya nilang gawin within their environment, and ano yung mga hindi nila kayang gawin. So ang magandang exercise din ito, no, especially when we discuss or when we design strategies for movements, ano nga ba yung mga kaya nating i-promise sa ating sector? Ano nga ba yung mga kaya nating ibigay sa mga kaya nating ibigay as an individual? Maganda rin tong self-assessment sa kung ano yung mga pwede nating gawin or pwede nating mabago, not only for ourselves but also for the environment that we exist in. Okay. Moreover, I think when we list down the things we can do, make sure that you're realistic about it. Because most of the time we tend to be idealistic. That's not bad, but I'm saying that we also have to we also have to reserve our energy. Because you cannot do everything. Even if you can think of it, you also need the help of others. But more importantly, when you write down the things that you could not do, it's also important to write down the actors that can do it for you. So for example, you could not change the policy or could not influence the policy alone. You also need the support of a party list of party lists that represent your sector, or you also need the support of other professionals or other university students that can help you write a petition letter, for example. So when we write down these things, it's also important to write down why can't we do it, which actors or which stakeholders can do it for us, who are we going to hold accountable, in the things that we could not change. So obviously, you could not change the economy of the Philippines in one by yourself. The people in power should do it, or the movements that you take or you partake in should do it. So I think that these are important things that we should keep in mind, or important exercises that we can do with our friends, with our colleagues, to help us exercise or help us understand or further realize the things we could do and we could not do. Okay. So we're down to the last stretch of our letters. So letter D is dealing with it as debaters. So this is where I tackle a more nuanced take as debaters. So we have to wear our debater hats and listen to this as debaters. So we have a collective responsibility as a community, or the Philippine Debate Union. So number one, isa siguro sa nakikita ko magandang forma ng consciousness raising or pagpapataas ng kamalayan ay pagsusulat ng mga statements. So ginagawa naman natin to as practices. So I think a lot of debate societies write statements for LGBT month, Women's Month, or even the martial law commemoration that we wrote as a community. I think that's a good way to help other people realize these as well, especially that our debate pages, hindi lang naman debaters yung engaged doon, even our university colleagues or university classmates or even outsiders. So I think statement writing should be a good exercise or a good practice for debate societies to be able to not only raise the awareness of their members, but to also partake in the international or national scale of discourse. So mahalaga na kinikilala din natin yung ating parte sa pagpapataas ng kamalayan ng bansa bilang mga debater. Kasi syempre, hindi, kasi maganda rin nating tignan to, no? Kasi isa siguro sa mga criticisms towards us, well, hindi naman siya pwedeng i-deny, ay may pagka elitist or may pagka too much intellectualism yung sport. So I think in order for us to break it down, or in order for us to engage with it, is to also partake in the national discourse. Second, purposeful motion setting. So hindi lang to for ADJ course, no? Pwede rin ito for debate societies who regularly train their members. So purposeful motion setting. So what do we mean with purposeful? Syempre with a purpose. So we don't just set motions for the sake of setting them. And I think one of the things I'm at fault, or one of the things that I'm guilty of, is that I set motions that are too niche, or I set in my past ADJ shapes that I'm not usually I'm not very proud of. I set motions that are very niche, philosophical motions that doesn't impact the real world in and of itself. But it's fun when we talk about it, or it's fun when we discourse about it. But in a closer investigation or in a closer look, I realized that, well, some motions that I made are not as useful or are not as realistic in a way that I want people to be impacted by it. So I think as debaters, we also have to we also have to adjust the standards or adjust the way we make motions or we set motions. So dapat purposeful, dapat may impact, dapat issue or nakikita siyang issue na pwedeng makapag-influence ng mga tao. So maganda rin na suriin natin suriin natin yung mga motions na debate natin or ginagawa natin. And I think this is the last, no? So, educational forums. So, I think very important committee na dapat lahat ng debate societies, and this is more of a suggestion, not an imposition, na magkaroon ay educational affairs or education and research. So, debate societies should, or I mean, not an imposition, again, it's more of a suggestion, normalize setting educational discussions, not just for the house of debating or the technicalities of debating, but also for the critical examination of society. So when we create educational forums or discussions within our debate societies, dapat hindi lang siya for the sake of matter loading or dapat hindi lang siya for the sake of knowing this for information's sake. Dapat para din siya sa pagpapalawig ng ating kamalayan at dapat action-centered din siya sa kung paano yung mga pwede nating gawin bilang alam na natin tong information na to, ano yung mga pwede nating i-contribute sa ganitong mga dimensions. Siguro, suggestion lang ulit, pwede maging potential initiative ng newly elected PDU officers, I guess, in upcoming NDC. They can partner up with progressive organizations or NGOs to invite them as resource speakers for debate-related events such as discussion drives or forums. So, para talaga sa akin, magandang initiative ng PIDC yung Issues Forum kasi hindi lang natin tinatackle yung mga bagay on a debate level, but we're also aiming to critically raise awareness. So, magandang initiative ito at sana ma-normalize siya in the upcoming years, especially for the upcoming generations of debaters. No, it's some people cope or help people debrief. So, syempre, after a specific motion that you think is emotionally charged, when you talk about women's struggles or when you talk about something personal, kasi obviously, personal is political and debate is political, therefore it can be personal. So, maganda na maging normal function din ng organizations or debate societies na magkaroon ng debriefing sessions after the round, especially if you don't feel okay or if you feel like you have a lot of things to say. So, ayun. I think that's all. Thank you so much for listening and good luck sa
Thanks so much, Mixed Gab. Debaters are indeed prone to compassion fatigue as a result of desensitizing ourselves to controversial and hostile news or matters. Your talk serves as a thoughtful reminder that some things are beyond our control and that we can be more intentional about the content we expose ourselves to in our day-to-day lives. Let us now proceed to the open forum portion of this event. We will now be accepting questions or comments from the audience, and you may either use the raise hand function and we will call you, or send a direct message of your question to me or to PIDC Tech via the Zoom chat. We have a question for Sir Jonathan. I'll read out the full comment here. Hi, Sir Jonathan. I'm a big fan of your work, The Architects of Disinformation. I'm also currently studying communication I'm currently studying communication and am a debater. My question is, what do you think of AI being used in political campaigns? Part of why trolls have been so prevalent was because of massive data sets on people. How should we navigate the electoral process from this context?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, and again, happy to connect. If you want to know more about our work, and if you want to collaborate or work with us in research projects. Yeah, so there's been a couple of examples of AI being and deep fakes being used for political campaigns. And surprisingly, at least the most specific examples that have emerged are deep fakes have been used as positive advertising. So they've been used by a politician in India to kind of like show that they're able to speak in a dialect, even though they're not really fluent in that dialect or in that language. So it's a way to target specific communities. And I think there was like another Biden deepfake, which is which was along those lines. And correct me if I'm wrong though. So um, and so I think AI makes it easy again to show how social media can be used to micro target and make oneself appear more relatable, and again underline the word appear, like only seem more relatable to specific communities. And I think that's a real struggle that, politicians, and that's a real objective of their campaign, right? And I think it's about to appear authentic, to appear relatable, and even, the kind of rebranding of Kamala Harris over the past couple of weeks. And it's so interesting to see that kind of social media energy around her, which is to show her as vibrant, energetic, like relatable, right? So I think that's interesting. Obviously we need to monitor like more insidious uses of deepfakes, also including to silence female politicians, using deepfake in pornography to kind of like shame female politicians. I think that's something that we need to also monitor as well.
Thanks so much for your answer, Professor Jonathan. We have a question here um, for Sir Gab. In connection with AI, what do you think is the priority when connecting with other people compassionately in the context of many individuals being uninformed with the technicalities of the digital landscape now?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? It's a bit laggy for me.
Okay. The question is, what do you think is the priority when connecting with other people compassionately in the context of many individuals being uninformed with the technicalities of the digital landscape today?
All right. I think one of the ways we can connect compassionately is we have to start where the people are. So dapat hindi natin sila tinitignan in a level na we think we're better than them. So obviously these are one of the key elements of basic human decency. We have to be humble as well, especially if they're um wait, is something echoing? Yeah, especially if they think especially if we think that they can be persuaded, but even if they're not persuadable to that extent, there could still be room for uh good discussions, or there could still be room for engaging with them compassionately. Because I think one of the notable key areas of, or one of the notable key weaknesses of Lenny's campaign was not on her campaign itself. It's based on one of the rabid followers of her campaign, or the kakampings, or the hardcore kakampings. So they said radical love, but after the elections, they resorted to victim blaming, or they resorted to antagonizing people. So I think it's more on understanding that these people have their unique perspectives as well, and understanding na meron din silang situations, and mahalaga na i-understand natin kung paano tayo mag-enter doon. And I think as debaters, there could be strategies. And I think very useful yung nuance, especially when we talk to people. Ayun lang.
Thank you so much. We have another question. This is for both speakers. So we'll first have Professor Jonathan and then Sir Gab answer the question. What advice would you give to young debaters facing apathy or burnout in their advocacy work, especially given the overwhelming nature of social and political issues today?
Wow. Yeah, a giant question that, yeah, I don't know where to begin. So I think the first um yeah, where I would begin is that, it's not just you. Um I think I think it is widespread. It cuts across different communities, different sectors. Yeah, I remember right after the elections of 2022, like a group of journalists also coming, yeah, just messaging me on Facebook, trying to work through the issue. Like these were journalists who I've never really interacted with, interpersonally, but more like in a public setting. And so they were like being raw and very honest. And I think that was like so shocking to me because journalists love to keep up like a facade of they don't want to show vulnerability. And then that set of issues, a group of like human rights workers. I'm sure Gab can also speak to his own, yeah, like the social work community. So human rights workers feel like, like what's the point of our work? Like nobody believes and trusts us anymore. Like when pagpupunta daw sila sa barangay, parang no one wants to talk with them anymore. So like their whole sector has been tarnished. Should they rebrand, right? Like in a very PR kind of way. And I think there's superficial aspect to that na parang should we rename ourselves? Or should we kind of like double down on our values? So I think it's not just you. So, and I think educators are feeling exhausted and burnt out. And I think how to respond to that is just to start rebuilding smaller communities and those safe spaces, you know, just to normalize showing and expressing vulnerability. I think that's a great start. I think people, especially in social media, we want to kind of like show and curate our, perfect lives. We got everything together. We have the easy answers, or that we don't want to even consider where we might be kind of mistaken, diba? Na parang we want to show like where we know everything. I think to admit that we have made mistakes, that we are willing to reconsider our path. I think to share those feelings with others, and I think to be seen in that vulnerability. That's where you regain courage. That's where you regain trust in yourself once again. And okay, um, I'm not alone in my feeling. What about you, Gab?
Yeah, I honestly believe that vulnerability is a good way. Yeah, to explore or to bring back or regain our courage. On my end, I think it's also important to understand our scope of control. Ano yung mga bagay na kaya nating kontrolin bilang individual, at ano yung mga kaya nating baguhin. Siyempre, hindi siya nag-exist lang on isolation. So, naniniwala ako sa collective responsibility as individuals who care and who empathize. So, mahalaga na hindi na natin nakikita yung responsibility of acting or mobilizing on our own. Mahalaga na nakikita natin ito as something na collective or kolektibo, bilang nag-exist din tayo sa lipunan or nag-exist din tayo sa communities natin. So siguro para maibsan din yung burnout or maibsan din yung kawalan ng compassion sa mga gantong sitwasyon, nakikita ko na magandang paraan din talaga yung paghahanap ng mga kagaya natin mag-isip, mga like-minded individuals na may pake sa lipunan. And I think talaga na maganda community yung debate, kasi nagde-debate tayo kasi not only for our confidence or not only to boost our egos, mahalaga na nire-reframe din natin yung motivations natin. We debate because we care, and I think that's a good statement, kasi it shows na we're courageous and we take stand on certain issues that we care about. So I think, yeah, collective responsibility talaga yung isa sa mga mahalagang bagay na kailangan na pinanghahawakan natin. Kasi hindi natin kayang baguhin lahat ng tayo lang. Mahalaga na may kasama tayo sa tagumpay o mga pagtatagumpayan natin bilang movement or bilang organization. So ayun.
Thank you so much for both of your valuable input on the question. Due to time constraints, we are on to our last question, and it's for Professor Jonathan. I'll read the full comment. I'm in the process of writing a thesis that concentrates on the socio-political discourse that occurs in low-income households. What recommendations would you provide for the approach that researchers, such as yourself, should employ to gain a comprehensive understanding of these discussions and apply to the development of policies that address prospective issues in these regions of the Philippines?
Great. And very important. Is it a thesis, research project? I hope, yeah, I wish you well. Again, feel free to connect. Happy to mentor, especially on, I'm teaching a class on qualitative research methods this semester, so I'm excited to hear about this topic. Yeah, importante yan. To meet people where they are, to kind of like map out their worldview and kung saan sila nanggagaling. Um, I agree with Gab that we shouldn't see ourselves as the expert, trying to look at them as like, who are these creatures, and like from that kind of far away kind of perspective, but actually to recreate their worldview and understand what are their real legitimate fears and anxieties, to treat that as real, right? Like, don't gaslight them, just like we don't want to be gaslit. Don't gaslight them that it's all a fabrication, it's all fake news. You were brainwashed by TikTok. There's a way in which some of the conversations that play out in the media, including by anti-disinfo advocates, including by journalists, including by advocates, by academics, I mean, who kind of interpret that the massa have been brainwashed by Facebook. Like, look what AI has done. People don't know what to believe. People are too dumb, right? Like, there's an easy slippage between the Bobotante discourse and the Facebook brainwashed, the trolls kind of discourse. And I think that obscures the real grievances that people have with the current system, the long histories of trauma that people who are marginalized, either through class or through gender, through their status as minorities. We need to engage with that as real historical traumas and not gloss over it as something technological or something that, a fandom for a politician would have just triggered. So I think to recreate that worldview and have open, non-judgmental conversations. As a researcher who is being welcomed by a community, see yourself as a guest of others. You're not the expert. They're the expert of survival. And so you have a lot more to learn from them. And I think to come at it from the first virtue of empathy, I think that is the real achievement of that kind of really grounded, community immersed work. And I think that's the most difficult kind of research. It's a very risky research as well. You yourself could be challenged by them. You could be seen as an outsider. You could be seen as, or even labeled as an elitista. And I think you need to develop, skills and strategies to manage those risks as well. And I think um, the work that you're doing comes from a longer tradition of people who have been doing that kind of good work. And so see yourself as part of that longer history as well, like from Mary Racelis, for example, who has done that with, understanding the poor of Tondo from the 70s, publishing as Mary Holsteiner. So that is a longer tradition that you're part of. And I think you need to be proud to learn from, people who have done that work as well.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the open forum. Once again, thank you to our keynote speakers and audience members for that fruitful and comprehensive forum discussion. At this point in the event, I would like to once again call Nicole, our Deputy Tournament Director, to award the Certificate of Recognition to our speakers. For our speakers, kindly also stay after the certificate reading for our picture taking.
Hello. So, first of all, on behalf of the organizing committee, once again, I would like to extend my warm thanks to Professor Jonathan Ong as well as to Mix Gabriel Pacanio for sharing their time and valuable insights today. So, we present the certificate of appreciation to Mix Jonathan Ong for sharing their time and valuable insights during the Issues Forum of the Philippine Intercollegiate Debating Championship 2024 held on September 6, 2024, given this day, 6th day of September 2024, signed by both Jade Benzon, the Tournament Director of PIDC, as well as myself, the Deputy Tournament Director of PIDC. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jade, and thank you, Nicole.
All right, and we also award and present the same certificate of appreciation to Gabriel Pacanio for sharing their time and valuable insights during the Issues Forum of the Philippine Intercollegiate Debating Championship 2024, held on September 6, 2024, given the 6th day of September 2024, signed by both Jade, the tournament director, and Nicole Mampin, myself, the deputy tournament director of PIDC. Thank you so much, Gap.
Thank you.
So we will now proceed with the picture taking. So first on the certificate of Sir Jonathan Ong. Fiona, kindly cue when you'll take the screenshot.
All right, so taking the screenshot in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, thanks so much. Next for Sir Gab.
Thank you so much for waiting. Taking the screenshot in 3, 2, 1.
Again, we immensely thank our speakers for their invaluable time and effort in providing productive discourse on such a timely topic. This serves as a reminder for us debaters and adjudicators to keep in mind our significant roles in transforming the truths. Before we end the program, we have a few reminders from the organizing committee. First, pre-council will happen at 1 p.m. For Insti reps, please do attend as the council will have voting matters to ratify breaks. Second, for participants who have yet to link themselves to Taptastic and are missing on Discord or have not answered the conflict form, please do so now in order to prevent tournament delays and errors. Third, check-ins for day 1 will run earlier from 1 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. to make time for extended briefings and to put up draws as soon as possible. Lastly, briefings will start right after the pre-council meeting at 2 p.m. The OrgCom strongly encourages everyone to attend, especially those who aren't familiar with tournament protocols. Kindly refer to the PIDC Facebook group for important announcements and contact persons should you have difficulties in accomplishing any of these tasks. Once again, thank you to everyone who participated in today's event. I am Aya, wishing you good luck and have a great time at PIDC.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Yay! Congrats, guys. Okay, we should also stop recording.
Yes, please stop recording.